Do you ever wonder what teeth actually taste like? And if everyone else's teeth taste different? What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Sounds Good Makes Sense, a discussion show for the Worldly Warcraft player. My name is Devilor, and today, especially with the launch of Season 1 in The War Within, I wanted to take some time and think about a lot of the different sort of like classifications and like tier listing, a lot of different class guides and that sort of stuff, the sort of things that you might be looking at going into Season 1, trying to determine what spec to play, what class to play, and how to actually go about optimizing your play within those. So specifically, there's three sort of main topics I want to hit on here. One is tier lists, where people just sort of rank things. One is class guides and how those are put together. And one is the actual like statistics that tend to be pulled for things like how are people doing in Mythic Plus and how are people doing in the raid instance, the sort of like ranking of how is everyone's parses doing inside of these different types of content. And I want to talk a bit about what they are to begin with, what they're good for, and also list off a few things that you should know about how these things tend to get put together that make them maybe not always exactly what they seem. Now, I do want to be very clear that the point of this video is not that you should not look at any of this stuff. The point of I will never say that you shouldn't go look at someone's tier list or you shouldn't read class guides. That's ridiculous. Or even that you shouldn't pay any attention to the DPS rankings and such that tend to come out of sites like Warcraft logs. That's not what I'm saying at all. All of that stuff has value and is very, very useful in its own way. It's just important to understand what in its own way actually means in the context of these things. I'm going to start with tier lists because this one is pretty straightforward and just a couple things to remember about this. Most of the time when someone's making a tier list, like these are the sorts of things that it's usually like some content creator or a streamer, or sometimes sites like WoW, like I know Wowhead just released some tier lists for things. Most of the time, this is just people trying to distill down to a basic sense what their sort of vibe is about each class or spec or whatever else it is that they're listing off. So they might go through and say, okay, let's give our tier list of tanks, and they'll list tanks off in whatever tier list or whatever order they use, usually S, A, B, D, and F for whatever reason. That's what people sort of settled on for these things. They'll usually list off, what are the good ones, what are the bad ones, and what are ones that are just kind of mid in the middle somewhere. And these are obviously, they tend to be very much opinion driven, especially if you're like watching someone's YouTube or whatever. It's going to be something where it's like, yeah, this is just how I feel about all of these. And they might be coming from the perspective of I'm a top end raider and this is who I would want to bring to my raid team. They might be coming from the perspective of which is the most fun to play and which are the ones that might be good, but I just don't want to deal with it, that sort of thing. Which is why it's important with these tier lists. Like, yeah, go ahead and watch your favorite content creators tier lists, list them. Like I'll probably end up doing some tier list content of my own at some point in the future, just because it's kind of fun, right? Like I did with the whole like 1 to 10 or however many it is ranking of the different World of Warcraft expansions in the past. I might at some point decide that I'm going to do a tier list of some capacity because it's a little bit different and it's just kind of fun to do and it can be interesting content to talk through it. But it's important to remember no matter what, when you're looking at someone's tier list, that it is, again, pretty much just a listing of what their kind of vibes are and how they came to those vibes. It's going to be different based on the person. So it's more important to understand exactly who it is and what their perspective is than necessarily sitting down one day and being like, oh, Maximum put out a tier list of what the best tanks are. Oh, and mine is on the bottom of that tier list. I guess I shouldn't play that anymore. Like, unless you're planning to go apply for Liquid, or like really start pushing for like top level, like epic endgame rating and mythic endgame rating and stuff like that, what he's looking for in a tank is probably not exactly the same as what you're looking for in a tank. So remember when looking through tier lists, just keep the perspective of the person giving it in mind, because they will be giving that, they're giving those rankings from the direction of what they believe is the most ideal or the most fun or whatever it is that they happen to be listing things of. And not necessarily like an empirical, this is the best, this is the worst. Keep those specific, those thoughts and perspectives in mind as you're actually looking at this. And one of the biggest reasons that I hammer on that a little bit is just because I've seen so many times in the past where some YouTuber will make their tier list of like what they think the most fun range DPS is or something. And they'll put something up at the top that's like relatively low on like overall parses or something. And people are like, wow, this guy's an idiot. because he doesn't understand that this spec is way better and this spec sucks and isn't very good or whatever. And like, just keep in mind, sometimes people are not interested in the same things. People are not pushing for the same things that you're necessarily pushing for. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at tier lists. You might not necessarily completely match with the perspectives and the opinions that the person putting it together is. But that's about all there really is to say about those. Again, they're really just opinion pieces. So let's move on. I want to talk a bit about class guides and how class and specialization guides and how those tend to come together, and some things that you should understand about that process and about how most guides these days end up getting put together, especially the like hardcore written guides that you'll see on sites like Wowhead, Icy Veins, and so on. How those are all put together, how those opinions and beliefs about how a class should be played get put into testing and how they figure that out in the first place, and then how they sort of filter that information out to you as the reader to try and figure out how you're even going to play this class that you've just picked up. One thing to think about with all of this is that a lot of these guides, especially at like the start of an expansion or prior to any new content coming out, when there's been a lot of class changes, a lot of these guides rely heavily on simulations. So the idea of they're going to get a sim put together, and sims today are pretty advanced. You can really simulate a lot with the tools that are available for running simulations for World of Warcraft these days. But they'll put sims together. They will get some modeling in place for the different new talents and abilities and trinkets and so on that are going to be available to you. And they will just run a bunch of tests, because that is a much more efficient, much more time efficient manner of trying to just try things a bunch of different ways than actually trying to like go and kill each raid boss 100 times or anything like that. Like, that's not going to happen. So they run these simulations to be able to get kind of a good guess, a good estimate, as close as possible to how WoW would actually calculate this stuff in the specific parameters of whatever simulation they're running. Basically, they try as much as possible to use math to sort of simulate how something would actually work out in practice, how things like rotations fit together, what the optimal rotation would end up being. And then they will go and they'll tinker around with stuff a little bit. They say, oh, what if we change around the rotation like this? Or what if we put this talent point in here instead? Or what if we change our stat weights like this or this? They will go and do a bunch of different testing. And a lot of this is also just automated these days by the simulation tools. Things like stat rankings and so on can be pretty much determined directly by the simulation tool, because it'll just say, okay, I'm just going to run with every single different stat and figure out how it's going to go. And I'll tell you which one is the best as a result of that, or what the priority list is as a result of that, which again is why a lot of these guides that you'll end up seeing say to sim your own character from time to time. Anyway, aside from all of that, the important core thing that I'm trying to get to here from all of this is that a lot of the guides, especially at the start of an expansion, have been written without much actual direct, like in the field experience for how content is going to exist in the new expansion, in the new season, and so on. And the reason that is important is because no matter how sensible a simulation is, no matter how great a guide is that's been put together, no matter how much testing has been done on the beta and so on, there's always the possibility that something just doesn't work out the way that is anticipated to, or some boss fight has some mechanic that you weren't expecting, or it turns out that in Mythic Plus, this specific type of enemy is more common than we expected. So therefore, things need to be changed a little bit as a result. So it's always worth looking at these guides as more or less, at least the approach that I take, is I will look at these guides as a baseline. I will say, okay, this is a good starting point. And I can start with, especially if it's a class that I haven't played in a long time, I will start with this. I will see how it feels from whatever they're telling me to do here. And then at some points I might decide, you know what, I actually really don't like using this ability, so I'll change that to something else, and so on. And obviously any decent guide author is already trying to filter for this as much as they can. Any decent guide author is already doing the work to try and figure out, like, how do we expect that this is going to actually go into practice once it's, actually in the game, as opposed to running it through a simulation. And a lot of guide authors just don't even use simulations in the first place. But oftentimes what they try to do is inspired by other people who are running simulations. So it's a bit back and forth and all over the place. It's complicated, essentially, is the point of what I'm trying to make there. But any decent guide author is trying their best to handle all of that thinking for you so that the resulting advice and information that they're giving you is as accurate as it can be. So I wouldn't overly worry about, like, oh, there might be some boss that is going to ruin everything. It's just the sort of thing that can happen. So it's important to think about when you're reading through these guides. If you're coming across something inside of a guide that you're like, that doesn't actually seem to match up with my expectation, it's at the very least worth asking around and trying to figure out why that choice was made, or perhaps it's something that you can look at and say, okay, maybe it's more of a player preference thing at this point. And it's for that reason that I always appreciate when a guide author, especially a written guide, is going into as much detail as they can about the why of why things are happening. Like when I just get a stat ranking, like a stat priority ranking, and it doesn't say why those stats work out that way at all, I always kind of side eye that a little bit, because like you can sit down and tell me like, yes, your stat priority is haste over versatility over mastery over crit or whatever it happens to be. You can just tell me that that's how it is, and that's great and all, but I would like to know, like, why is versatility, like, this is something that happened recently for me when I'm trying to understand a couple of different guides and how they had ranked versatility versus mastery for Windwalker Monk. I was like, why is versatility rated higher than mastery? And I still don't have a great answer for that. Honestly, I'll be honest, I still don't have a great answer for that. A lot of what people have been saying about Windwalker is that the reason versatility ends up higher is because it affects more things than mastery does, but it would have to affect enough at the rate at which those two stats scale. It would have to affect enough things that it's more than 50% of your damage, which it doesn't really seem to be the case. Like, half of my damage is not things that aren't affected by mastery. So I still don't really understand where that's coming from. I'm just, at this point, I'm going to do some testing, but that's the point. That's the sort of thing where I think it's important to approach these guides and look at them and go, okay, hold on. Something seems kind of off here. Maybe I'll try it this way, or maybe I'll try it that way, or just do some experimentation, see if you can figure it out on your own. It's always important to take those guides as a starting point and then adapt to your own play style and the way that you want to enjoy the character as well. There's several guides that I've read where it will even say things to that effect, where it's like, here's this talent. This talent is technically the highest DPS offering for you, or the highest throughput offering for you, or whatever, but it's tricky to use. So only take this if you're comfortable using it. And in which case, a lot of players are very likely to actually get better performance taking a different choice in that, because if they take the easier choice, it's at least constant and guaranteed throughput, as opposed to trying to super optimize something particularly goofy or weird. Like, again, going to the monk example, Feline Stomp is one that if you're doing fist weaving style is pretty important. But maybe that's the sort of thing that if you're like, I just really don't feel like being in melee and doing all this, maybe you want to go with a different spec entirely. I guess it's not called Feline Stomp anymore. I always forget what it's. Jade Fire Stomp, I think, is the actual name of it these days. But maybe you want to do something different, because the way that is considered to be the optimized approach for whatever sort of content that you're doing is not necessarily what's going to work best for you. And it's also important to understand the perspective and the experiences of the person who has written the guide as well, just like it is with tier lists, but to a less extreme degree, I think. Because these guides, it's still the value of a guide is taking theoretical information and applying that to experience, so that you can turn that into something that says, hey, like, hey kid, I've been doing this for ages. Let me tell you how it's done. Let me show you how to do this. Let me explain to you how this should be done. A guide that's written purely off of just theoretical, I've never actually played the spec, but I've read all the talents, and so here's how I think it's going to work. That's never going to be as useful as one that's been written by someone who has spent a significant amount of time learning and playing the class, because there's a lot of little things that tend to come up in the way that World of Warcraft is played that you just wouldn't necessarily think is going to be a problem until you're actually trying to do it. There's a lot that the practical application of the theoretical knowledge becomes more difficult, or might change the way that you want to approach certain things. And this is especially important for sites like the ones that tend to have a guide for every individual class or whatever, because realistically, there's 36 specs in the game. They're not going to necessarily want to hire 36 guide authors who are all the best that has ever existed at that specific class or that specific spec, right? They're not going to go and find 36 different people who have been maining this spec for a long period of time, even if they could, that also happen to be a good guide writer. Like that's just not going to happen. So oftentimes what occurs is you'll have someone writing a guide who, like, yeah, maybe they're a super awesome Holy Priest, for example. They've been playing Holy Priest. They've been playing Discipline for a long time. They really know the ins and outs of healing as a priest. And then they also need someone to write a guide for Shadow. And so they'll be like, hey, do you think you could write a guide for Shadow? And they'll be like, oh, sure, yeah, I can figure it out and I'll write a guide for it, because they just want to get a guide up. That's not necessarily the same as having someone who has been maining Shadow Priest for the past 4 expansions writing that guide and telling you the ins and outs of exactly how that works. And this is the sort of thing, like, it just kind of happens from time to time where the guide is written by someone who doesn't necessarily main that spec And that doesn't mean that they're wrong about anything that's in there. That doesn't mean that the information is incorrect. That doesn't even mean that it's a bad guide at all. It's just the sort of thing to keep in mind. Maybe there are some things that you might encounter if you are playing this spec a lot that they just didn't run into because they just haven't spent as much time on it. And it's also worth noting, like, most of the time guides are written for the perspective of like, what is the best way to play this spec, which makes sense, right? Like if you you would sit down and you would think to yourself, I want to tell people how to play a enhancement shaman. So I'm going to write down what the best way to play an enhancement shaman is. And I understand that perspective and I understand how things get to that point. I do wish that more guide writers and more guide authors in general focused on like, how do you get started playing this? Like what's a beginner friendly way to play this spec first? Because a lot of these specs end up like getting really, really complicated and really throwing a ton of stuff at people. And realistically, if you're reading a guide, if you're looking up a guide for a class, it's probably not because you're going to turn up to Echo's main raid with it tomorrow. It's probably because you haven't played this spec in a while, if at all ever, and you're trying to get an understanding of how to actually play it. And so a lot of times you'll look at these guys and there'll be 40 different like builds and stuff that you can look at that, well, not that many. There'll be like 4 or 5 different builds and stuff you can look at. And then they'll have one that's just like, oh, and this is the easy one for beginners. And it's like, maybe think about how to graduate people from that beginner one to the more difficult ones. Start with the beginner one as a basic and then go from there, as opposed to trying to jump people directly into the deep end and then saying, if this is all too complicated, start with this basic one instead. I don't know. That's more of a like personal preference for me, I guess. I feel like if you're trying to teach people something, you should start with the basics and then move on from there. But maybe that's just me. I don't know. Anyway, long and the short on class guides is they are almost certainly going to at least get you a good starting point, but feel free to look through guides and form your own opinions. If something just seems wrong and off about a guide, like what I've been doing with the whole Windwalker thing I was talking about earlier, so I've actually been going around to different guides and seeing if everyone is saying the same thing. And so far, not quite, actually. So far, there's a little bit of variance in there. So I'm just going to do some experimentation. But feel free to ask yourself those questions, understand what they're trying to tell you from the beginning, and then start putting that into practice, and then start actually thinking about what are some different ways that you can improve on this? What are some things that aren't working out for you the way that it seems like it should be? Look at your own play as a result, see if it's just something that you're doing wrong, or see if there's something that you can change that might improve your performance, even if it's not necessarily what a guide told you. The last thing that I want to hit on for today's episode is rankings, like DPS rankings, the sort of things, you know, the blue bars that you see. Usually they're pulled from a site like Warcraft, and pretty much always these days pulled from Warcraft logs. These sort of stacked rank with the different progress bars that show how well everyone did. These are ostensibly a statistical representation of all of these different specs performance over the last week. So you'll look in the raid performance and you'll see a bunch of bars that say how well people did in the raid. You'll look at Mythic Plus performance. You'll see a bunch of bars over how people are performing in Mythic Plus. And that's not inaccurate. Like it is, that's not an inaccurate statement, I should say. It is accurate to say that it is a statistical representation of everyone's performance, but it's statistics. And anyone who's spent a lot of time working with statistics can tell you that what you see when you look at statistics is not necessarily exactly what it seems like. Generally speaking, when we're talking about DPS rankings, we're not talking about every parse that was ever done, because then like you would be including people who were AFK or who died on the pull, or this is the first time they've ever played World of Warcraft and they got dragged along to their friend's run and stuff like that. This, you would be including a lot of really, really awful parses that are awful for reasons that have nothing to do with the spec as a result. So when we're looking at these DPS rankings, we're usually looking in like the 90th to 95th percentile. I think most sites are usually looking at the 95th percentile, which, quick reminder on percentile, just because people mix this up all the time, 95th percentile means the top 5%. It means they were better than 95% of parses, right? So when you get a parse and it says you are in the 95th percentile, congratulations, you are in the top 5%. Occasionally I'll see people being like, oh, heck yeah, I got a parse in the 20th percentile. I'm top 20%. That's not what that means. That means you're top 80%. And in fact, most parses were better than yours in that situation. So that's what percentile means. Anyway, most of the time we're looking at the 90th to 95th percentile. We don't go all the way to 99th percentile because the data set is too small at that point. And we don't want to go all the way to like the 10th percentile or something, because then you're including a lot of data that's just not helpful or relevant. And you can see how much looking at a different percentile actually changes the results by going back. Like, just go back to the Amir Drazil rankings from or statistics on Warcraft logs from the end of Dragonflight. If you go and you look at that and you put it on the 99th percentile, you end up with Beast Mastery Hunter on top, and Subtlety Rogue is all the way down at like 18th or something. It's super low on the list. But then if you change that to the 10th percentile, all of a sudden now Beast Mastery drops to like 6 on the list, and Subtlety Rogue for some reason is all the way up at the top. I don't understand exactly why that happened, but you can tell the difference by the difference between looking at the top 10% of parses, or sorry, the top 1% of parses, or the top 90% of parses. There are significant differences that then change in terms of those rankings. So the reason that we typically look at the 90th to 95th percentile when we're talking about DPS rankings is because then you have enough of a sample size that it's not just a few fluke crazy good attempts that happen. Like, there's enough parses in there that you can actually pull some reasonable data and reasonable conclusions from the data without having to worry too much about just crazy outliers. But we'll come back to that. But also at this point, we're now weeding out all of the garbage parses, the ones where whatever happened in this parse had nothing to do with the actual player's ability to play the game. It had nothing to do with something weird that happened on that specific poll. It's more or less like we don't have the ones where someone went AFK halfway through, essentially. But the fact that we're just looking at the top parses has some like secondary effects. Not so much in terms of the actual like order that the specs go in, but the differences between them. Sometimes the order will change very slightly, but if you're looking through like the quote unquote real parses, like if you go from 80th to all the way up to 99th, there will be a couple of little changes in there, but it's not going to change dramatically. But what will change is, like I said, that order of magnitude between them. The difference in total performance and total DPS output from the person on the top and the person on the bottom is going to be slightly exaggerated. And this is because when we're looking at the top parses, we're essentially looking at the polls where everything went right. Like the best parses, especially as time goes on, that's going to just sort of filter itself into, these are the polls where all of my procs lined up properly. These are the polls where everything went right for me. The boss windows happened at the right time. We killed it fast enough that more of my time was spent during Bloodlust than it was otherwise. And so what that essentially then means is that the most popular specs, the ones that people gravitate towards, those end up getting inflated very slightly in terms of their overall numbers, just because there are more potential opportunities for people to have gotten a crazy, ridiculously good parse. You will see more of, like, say, Fury Warrior is considered to be the best DPS class in the game, right? You will see more people playing Fury Warrior as a result, which means there are more Fury Warriors to have that opportunity to just get a crazy, ridiculously good parse where everything has gone well. So then if you're looking at the top 5% of all Fury Warrior parses, and you say that ends up being 50 to 100 parses because of the number of people that are playing. Also, it's worth noting all of this is opt-in as well. This isn't like empirical data from across all of World of Warcraft. You actually do have to upload logs to Warcraft logs, or have someone in your raid uploading logs to Warcraft logs for them to be counted. There's enough people to do that it still ends up being fairly accurate data, but it does still have to happen. Anyway, if you have 50 to 100 parses in this sample size for Fury Warriors, but then the top 5% for, say, Subtlety Rogue is only like 12 parses as a result, because fewer people are actually playing that, then that means that there's a higher degree of variance between what is considered a really, there's a higher degree of variance in the potential that the parses that are being looked at are actually the best case scenario versus just there were only so many parses to actually look at. Long story short, if a spec is popular, its numbers will be slightly inflated. If a spec is not popular, its numbers will be slightly reduced. And that's just the nature of how pulling statistics like this works out in this sort of stack rank situation. Now, again, I'm not saying that the order that they are listed in is wrong. You can probably still look at these and reasonably state, like the example I was just giving, you could still reasonably state a Fury Warrior is capable of more DPS than a Subtlety Rogue, and that would probably be accurate, again, in that hypothetical example that I was just giving. I don't actually know what it works out to be in this, like, today. I don't know what it's going to be in season 1 as of yet, but the stack ranking, the order is probably still correct. But if you're looking at this and you're saying, well, I really want to play Subtlety Rogue, but they're so far down on the list, like that I can't play Subtlety Rogue. They're too bad. Keep in mind that they are going to look worse than they actually are in these stack rankings. You could still, by playing a Subtlety Rogue very well, again, in this hypothetical situation, you could still perform probably on average or better than a lot of other people would be doing. Because again, remember, we're just looking at what the best parses were, right? So if you're a spec that maybe you're a spec with a lot of RNG, this actually happens to Elemental Shaman a lot because they have a lot of RNG to their total DPS output, with not only crit being a thing outside of Lava Burst, obviously, but crit is a thing. Crit is a thing for everyone. So if you just happen to get lucky and crit literally every attack in a given pull, you would do more damage than you otherwise would be capable of. Elemental has elemental overload on top of that, where sometimes you cast a spell and it casts like another 5 to 6 times. And that's just how it ends up working out, especially now with the Farseer tree in place in War Within. There's just so much potential for extra casts to happen purely off of RNG. So when Elemental is popular and when people are playing a lot of Elemental, it tends to go way up the list because those top parses are the ones where people just happen to get a lot of Elemental overload procs. When Elemental is less popular and people just don't think it's very good, it drops way down the list because there are fewer parses then being done, which means there's lower opportunity for those crazy, ridiculous, I got a billion Elemental overload procs on this given thing. Anyway, I don't want to harp on this too much because a lot of it is just complicated math that's too much to try and explain in this video. But just understand the nature of statistics like this is that the more popular a spec is, the higher its numbers are going to appear to be. And that's not by enough of a difference to really make the overall stack ranking different. Again, I want to make sure that that part is clear. I'm not saying that you should look at these statistics and see somebody on top and say, well, it's just because they're popular. They're probably actually near the bottom. No, that's not true. That's not likely to be the case at all. It's just this sort of thing to understand, like, just because the spec that you want to play, which is a less popular spec, seems to be like 10% behind whatever the most popular spec is, it's probably not actually a 10% difference. It's probably more like, I don't know, 5 or 6%. And it's important to consider as well, like, how good are you at this spec? Like, if you're someone who's sitting down and you're looking at this DPS rankings and you're saying, oh man, my spec is so low on these DPS rankings, I need to switch to something else. Like, I'm around like 9th or 10th on this, but if I just switched to that Fury Warrior, then I'd be on top and I would be doing so much more damage. Like, that's only true if you can play Fury Warrior as well as you can play your existing spec, right? If you're going to switch to a spec that you are either not as good at, or maybe it's a spec that you just don't like as much, so you're not going to then invest as much of you. If you're the sort of person who plays like this, there are people who will absolutely invest, they will hate the spec that they're playing, and they will still play it the best it can possibly be played. That person absolutely exists. There's a lot of them. But if you're not that person, if you're someone who is only going to be really interested in pushing super hard on a spec and really trying to optimize a spec, if you're also having fun playing it, this is how I end up being most of the time. You're going to do better as a spec that is considered less effective because you're enjoying yourself more. You're having fun. It's a video game. It's crazy, right? And another quick aside while we're talking about rankings, just because it's I think worth mentioning, the reason that rankings are really only ever focused on DPS is because historically modeling tanking and healing hasn't really been super accurate, at least not in terms of performing the role that they're there to do. Tanking, for example, a lot of what makes a good tank has obviously the ability to stay alive is important, and the damage that they deal is important, which is why tanks are still included in DPS rankings. In fact, healers are still included in DPS rankings as well. But there's things like positioning to think about. Like, is your tank actually good at getting things to where they're supposed to be? Is this spec better or worse at moving the boss from spot to spot and so on? Is this spec better or worse at surviving burst windows when something crazy is going on and there's a lot of raid damage going out, so the tank is receiving less healing? Are they going to be able to keep themselves alive as well as another tank might do in that situation? And this is all just stuff that, like, there are theoretically like ways to answer these questions, but there are theoretically ways to put together rankings for all of this stuff, but they would be so complicated and so subject to opinion, honestly, that it's actually easier just to see how people are doing in practice, right? It actually becomes easier to just try tanking something as a brewmaster or try tanking something as a death knight and see what happens. And that sort of information and knowledge then tends to circulate anyway. And so there isn't as much of a need for a like ranking, a stack ranking of which tanks are doing the best right now, because people just talk to each other and they kind of understand it. Healing is a little bit different. Healing, there are actually usually rankings for healers, but I kind of ignore them because realistically, the way to parse on healing is by having your raid stand in stuff that they're not supposed to, or playing the game very like really realistically. If you're putting out the most healing, like if you're putting out the top parses for healing, it's because your raid did something dumb, or you did something dumb, or both. Like, in order for healing to go out, there has to be damage to heal, which means that the top healing parses are caused by people taking damage that they didn't necessarily need to be able to take. So this is why healing and tanking rankings aren't really something that come through statistics all that often. People don't really pay attention to those. DPS rankings, however, on the other hand, those are a lot more straightforward because it's literally just how much damage did you do on this fight. Now, I want to say again before we move on, I do have a question that we're going to get to today, but I want to say again before we move on to that, do not take any of what I have said here as these things not being valuable. Tier lists can still be valuable, especially if it's someone that you trust and you really believe their opinions on things. Class guides are obviously still valuable. You need to know how to play your class. Go read these guides. If that's something that you want to do, go read these guides and learn what you can from them. Even the DPS rankings, like this is still valuable data. This is still useful information to look at and see how are people stacking up and what are the actual parses that are coming in through Warcraft logs and so on. What are they actually, well, how are these things actually doing? Like this is still actually valuable data to look at. It's just important to always look at it and understand exactly what you're looking at, as opposed to just looking at DPS rankings and saying, well, looks like that spec's the best one. Why doesn't Blizzard just buff this other spec by 4% to match up with it? Because it doesn't actually work out that way because of the nature of how those statistics are pulled. Except, of course, for when it would actually work out that way, if it would be the case that just putting a blanket 4% buff on some spec might put them in line with everyone else. But that gets super complicated, and that's kind of a different topic entirely. Anyway, I hope that was all at least interesting to think about. So this is more of a stuff to think about episode than necessarily a here's how to do this right or wrong sort of way. This is not a guide itself. This is just some information for your awareness that I thought was worth considering and discussing, especially since we're going into a brand new season, the first season of The War Within. So this is stuff that's going to be coming up a lot over the next weeks and months. Hopefully you found that interesting. But I'm going to move on to answer this question that came in. This came in from Jeff on YouTube, who asked, I'd be interested on your take of what appears to be a very limited level of communication so far. So for starters, just because I feel like I have to for this question, I'm going to have to make a lot of assumptions about what exactly you're referring to here. And these are relatively educated assumptions, but there are some assumptions that I have to make about what you're talking about when you say limited level of communication. You actually managed to use a very limited level of communication to ask about a limited level of communication. And that's just kind of funny to me. Like there's some things that I have to assume about this. First of all, I have to assume that you're talking about The War Within, and you're talking about there just hasn't been a ton of new posts that have been made on what topic. I couldn't say. I'm not sure what topics you're looking for answers on here. I will say that part of why I think we're not seeing as much just like volume of posts right now was because there hasn't been anything catastrophically broken with The War Within. At least not to the level of some previous expansions like Mists of Pandaria or Warlords of Draenor, for example, where in both of those expansions, an entire faction got locked behind one of the starting quests and was not able to complete it. Like we haven't had anything that catastrophic happen in World of Warcraft for a while. They have been communicating quite a bit on several different things. A lot of outgoing communication has been happening. There hasn't been a ton of what I would consider reactive communicating, but there has been tons of outgoing communication. Like they've been talking a lot about the upcoming 20th anniversary event. They've been talking a lot about, like in the classic side of things, there's a Season of Discovery PTR up right now that they've been talking about a bunch. So there has been communication happening. It seems like it's probably not the communication that you're looking for, in which case I would just make sure that you're asking like, what topics is it that you want to see them communicating about? Personally, I would like to see a little bit more discussion, and I can understand why it hasn't been happening yet, but I would like to see a little bit more insight into plans for balancing that are going to come out. I know they just posted, I haven't actually had a chance to read them yet, but they posted that there's going to be some class tuning coming up soon. I'm happy to see that. I would like to have seen a little bit more of that as we were going through the like heroic dungeons phase and stuff, but I can understand why they would want to wait until Mythic Zeros and until the raids start to open up to actually start pushing a lot of that. So I'm not super upset about that myself. Obviously, there was some communication that went out about the leveling changes that they had to do, and that's the sort of thing that I would generally expect to see during the launch of an expansion as far as reactive communication, is when there's something broken that needs fixing. Otherwise, there are so many more important things for especially the community team to be doing with their time at the launch of an expansion than just going and talking for the sake of talking. Because here's one thing that I want to make sure is clear. Outgoing communications for the majority of a community team, outgoing communications are actually priority number 2. Priority number 1 is incoming communications. They want to be looking through the forums. They want to be looking through social media everywhere. They want to be gathering as much, like Discords, etc. They want to be gathering as much information as they can so that that information can make it to the development team. You cannot have the second priority, which is the outgoing communications, if you don't do that incoming communications first. You need to take this information to the devs. What are people talking about? What do people want to see? And you need to be taking that to the devs and getting that information to them so that the development team can then act on this feedback and other discussions that are happening throughout the community. And if in the course of doing that, there's nothing that comes up that is like, we need to answer this, we need to get an answer out for this right now, it is more important and more useful for everyone, including the player base, if the community manager then decides, okay, I don't need to worry about writing up, I don't need to spend the next hour or two putting up a post for this, when I could be spending that hour or two gathering more information and gathering more knowledge on what is happening elsewhere in the community, right? It is important for them to be spending as much time as possible just looking and seeing what players are doing, looking and seeing what people are talking about, what complaints people have, gathering that information, packaging that up into a more digestible format than 400 forum posts or whatever, and getting that over to the development team. So usually I would not expect, especially right after a launch, I would not expect a ton of just chit chat to occur. And I would not expect a ton of answers to immediate questions that aren't like super incredibly priority along the terms of like something just being completely broken. And yes, everyone's going to have a different idea of what completely broken actually means in that context. For some people, completely broken means my class is 2% lower on the DPS charts than this other class. For some people, completely broken just means they can't log in, and that's basically it. And we haven't had as much, there's been some issues here and there, but we haven't had as much of that second issue where the game is just unplayable for people. And that's the sort of communication that would take priority. I think the reason that we're not seeing so much just general talking and general discussion about the day-to-day at this point is partially because there hasn't been anything that catastrophic, and partially because they are waiting until season 1 actually starts to do a whole lot of changes for things. So if they don't have anything to say yet, they probably shouldn't say that. Like one thing I've definitely learned one thing I definitely learned during my time as a community manager working on World of Warcraft is that telling people you don't have an answer yet doesn't make anyone happy. Doesn't help at all in the slightest. In fact, if anything, it makes people more annoyed that you bothered to tell them that you don't have anything to tell them yet. Like, then go find something to tell me instead. Spend that time elsewhere doing something useful. I'll also note, just for general awareness as well, I actually think the WoW community team is spread pretty thin at the moment. My understanding is that the team is actually smaller than it was before I left. And they have more things to be communicating about now than they did back then. Like Blizzard really needs to like expand, like give the community team the proper resources that they need. If they want people to be able to have time, if they want community managers to be able to have time to just go and talk to people on the forums, instead of focusing on all the data gathering that it tends to be a huge part of the job, they need more people to be able to do that. I'm pretty sure the team is actually smaller than it was before I left these days, partially due to layoffs and partially due to, well, I left, so that's one less person. But I think the team is actually smaller these days, and they have more things. They have obviously War Within that just came out, needs to be communicated about. They've got stuff going on with, there's like 3 different versions of Classic that are playable right now, all of which are occasionally going to have their own communication needs that are necessary. There's the 20th anniversary thing coming up that they're just starting to talk about now as well. Like there's a lot for them to be doing. And there's only so many of them. So a lot of these people are like, they're former coworkers and friends of mine. And I understand that they're in a rough situation right now and they need some more help. So dear Blizzard, hire more community managers. But yeah, hopefully that helps give at least a little bit of insight into the level of communication that we're seeing so far. I do expect that we'll start to see that ramp up once season 1 is launched, and especially once Mythic Plus is available next week. I do expect that we'll start seeing more communication as a result of that, because then they'll actually just have more things to talk to us about in terms of, okay, here's what we're seeing, and so here are some changes that we're going to make in terms of like class balance. Here are some things that are occurring with the raid and so on. There's things that are occurring inside these dungeons. They will just have more stuff to actually talk about than they did during this. They'll have delve stuff to talk about too. Like delves are now available up to a higher level. So I definitely think there's a lot of interesting stuff for them to be talking about in the near future. I don't think there was a ton for them to like. There isn't anything that I'm sitting here going, oh, I can't believe they haven't commented on blank at this point. Like there's nothing that sticks out like that to me. So I'm assuming that's more or less why things are the way they are. Anyway, that's about enough out of me. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up. I'm actually kind of losing my voice a little bit, which is a problem for someone who talks for a living. I live in Southern California and it's fire season, and there's actually a ton of fires, like just none that are super close to the point where I'm worried about them, but there are a ton of fires around, which means there's a lot of smoke in the air, which means we got the old filters going like crazy, but it's still like ragging on my throat a little bit. So that's fun. That's great. SoCal, it's certainly a place to live. Anyway, thanks so much once again, everybody, for listening, watching, however you consume this content. I really do appreciate it. Thanks again to my patrons who really help all of this keep going. If you are interested in checking out my Patreon, you can go to patreon.com/Devilor. You get a cool, few fun little perks as a result of being a patron. So go over and check that out. Also, if you would like to have a question answered here on the show, please leave that as a comment on the YouTube episode, or if you are on Patreon, if you're a patron over there, there's a link to a form that you can fill out that gives you priority to have your question answered here on the show. So go ahead and check that out. I'm going to wrap it up. Thanks again, everybody. I'll see you later.